Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being with us today. We've been talking a lot about culture in the past months. The ripple effects of last year's shift to remote work are settling in, and we're realizing flexible work is here to stay, and that the talent landscape has fundamentally shifted. In what is now being called the Great Resignation, 4 million people quit their jobs in April alone. And money had little to do with it, as top talent searches for more flexibility and more happiness. In today's Expert Insight, we will explore how we as leaders can proactively take action to shape culture, the one we want in the future. How will our decisions and strategic vision on culture determine who gets the top talent? To lead us as we explore these new challenges and opportunities is thought leader Kevin Oakes. Kevin's the author of the book, Culture Renovation, A Blueprint for Action. He is also the CEO and co-founder of I4CP, a leading authority on next practices in human capital. He works with businesses and HR executives on people practices that drive high performance, and Kevin is considered one of the foremost experts on organizational culture. Kevin, we feel so fortunate to have you here today. Welcome.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Kim. Great to be here today. Appreciate that. So if you're ready, Kim, I can just dive in and share my screen and share my presentation. So let me do that. Hang on one second. All right. Well, I am coming to you all from sunny Seattle. It doesn't rain here all the time, as you can see behind me. But I know we've had a lot of weird weather throughout the country and hurricanes and such. So hope everybody's been safe and managed through okay. So as Kim described, I'm going to talk to you today about my book, Culture Renovation, but just more broadly, I think what companies are going through today in light of an ever-changing environment. Now, Kim mentioned I'm the CEO of I4CP. I know it's a lot of numbers and letters, but it stands for the Institute for Corporate Productivity. And let me just give you a quick background on who we are, just to set the stage. We are a research company first and foremost, and we focus on HR research. In fact, we're doing more HR research than just about anybody on the planet. And it's always with a business lens in looking at the people practices of high performance organizations. And I'll use that term sometimes throughout the presentation. What I mean by high performance are companies that have better revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer sat than their competition. And what my team of analysts does on a regular basis, they look at those companies over a 5-year time horizon. Things change that rapidly. And we're looking at not only what are those top companies doing with their people practices that's different than low-performing organizations, but specifically through regression analysis and other methods, what practices are correlating to bottom-line business impact from an HR standpoint. And certainly a lot of what we talk about today has direct impact to the financial performance of organizations. Now, we're fortunate that we work with a lot of very well-known organizations. This is just a thumbnail of some of the companies that we work with, but you'll recognize most of the logos that are on the screen. And I'll be referencing some of these companies in the presentation itself and giving you a couple case studies from these companies. So let's dive into the book. The book was published earlier this year, and it's done quite well. I'm fortunate that I had a lot of great support from best-selling authors like Brene Brown or Tom Rath. He wrote the foreword for the book. Dan Pink, Marshall Goldsmith, they've all done a great job just supporting the book overall. But probably more importantly, I was able to interview a number of leading CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, as well as heads of HR, to really get their stories into the book. And one of the best compliments I received from a head of HR the other day about the book is that it doesn't read like a business book. It reads more like a novel because there's so many stories about companies and their real life situations. But I think probably the biggest reason why the book has done well is just because of the environment that we're in today. And I think a lot of companies are quite concerned about the culture of their organization, how it's been affected throughout the pandemic and today, as we deal with the Delta variant and things that we thought we were through with, I think a lot of organizations are looking at their culture and thinking, how can we be proactive and shape the culture that we want, rather than be reactive or just let things happen to our culture and not take control of it. And I guarantee you that your organization's culture has changed during the pandemic and continues to change. Some of that change isn't bad. Some of that change has actually been very good, but it definitely has changed. And as you can tell from some of these headlines, there has been a lot of concern about culture. And as we thought we were returning to the office, and many organizations are still planning on returning to the office or to the workplace or work site, we've obviously had to rethink some of those plans based on the Delta variant. And we're studying this on a daily basis, and a lot of companies have had to reshape their plans and announce different plans going forward. In fact, we just completed a study where we asked organizations about any changes they're making in response to the Delta variant. And you can see that well over half of companies have said they have changed or plan to change or are considering a change to their return to the office, but also with things like mask mandates, their decisions about flexible work. Kim said flexible work is here to stay. She's absolutely right. A lot of companies are really trying to get into how they're going to make flexible or hybrid work for them as an organization. It's one thing to say you'll allow it, but then the complexities of how you roll that out and handle it are just myriad. And we're dealing with companies on those complexities every day. Vaccination mandates has been a huge thing, as has people rethinking business travel. But on the vaccine mandates, that's been a question we've been working with a lot of companies on lately. It wasn't too long ago, just a couple months ago, that very, very few companies had no plans to mandate vaccines. Today, as you can see from our headline on the lower left, over 50% of companies are now considering it. Nearly 25% of the Dow have already mandated vaccines for workers. And that was an article from a week ago. It's probably even more today. And this is a daily change that we're seeing happening out in society. And so from a culture standpoint, these are all concerns on what are those vaccine mandates, our flexible and hybrid work policies, our return to the office schedule. What is it doing to our culture? But I started writing this book before the pandemic, and culture was already a big deal then. By the way, I meant to mention this. We have a study on all of these issues. It's called From Cube to Cloud that we just published, and it goes into quite some depth around some of these issues and is certainly a study to take note of if this is something you want more info. But as I was saying, I started studying this before, and my team did, before the pandemic. And it was very clear that corporate culture was already a top concern inside of organizations, particularly with senior executive teams and boards of directors. And boards are getting the message that they need to look at culture from organizations like the NACD here in the United States, who put out a wonderful report called Culture as a Corporate Asset. We were fortunate enough to interview most of the authors of that report, and they're all sitting board members for public companies and chairs of boards in some cases. And they said in that report that the oversight of corporate culture should be among the top governance imperatives for every board. Now, one of the reasons they're saying this is because of corporate scandals that we're all probably far too familiar with. We've seen a number of them over the years, whether it was the Boeing 737 MAX tragedies that the U.S. House of Representatives blamed on a culture of concealment, or the Wells Fargo sales scandal that was also blamed on a sales culture that was too incentivized to open up those accounts fraudulently. We've probably all read about the downfall of WeWork and how their toxic culture really derailed their IPO. We could go on and talk about some of these. But as Jamie Gorelick, who's one of the authors of that report, said, and she's on the board of Amazon and VeriSign, She said what boards really want to know is, are they sitting on quicksand? They just want to have a better understanding of the culture of the company that they're governing. Now, I've sat on a lot of boards. I've run a lot of boards. I continue to be on boards. I always notice that corporate culture is often 95% filtered through the eyes of the CEO. That's the only indication the board really has on corporate culture. There's rarely independent data, and maybe the board will pick up some elements of culture from the CFO or a couple other executives that they interact with, but there's oftentimes not a lot of info on corporate culture until one of these scandals happens. And that's what the NACD is trying to caution against, is looking at culture in more depth and pressuring senior leadership to provide that data, provide more insight into culture. Some of these boards are even setting up separate culture subcommittees, just like the governance or nominating committee. Citigroup is one company we work with that has had a culture committee for a couple of years now that reports out to the board and looks at some of that culture data. I suspect we'll see more of that. We're also going to see more heads of HR, either current or former, sit on corporate boards. If there's one thing the pandemic taught a lot of these boards, is that they probably over-architected on financial acumen, and they under-architected on human capital acumen on the board itself. And so you're going to see a lot more emphasis on human capital acumen going forward with these boards. But scandals aren't the only reason why companies are concerned about culture. They're also concerned just from a pure competitive standpoint. I wrote about in the book, and you're all probably familiar with the term unicorn, which is a definition for companies that are private that have a valuation of over $1 billion. And this was a term coined in 2013 by Aileen Lee, a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. At the time that she created that term, there were 39 unicorns. Today in the world, there are well over 700. And so this is sort of a time continuum of how we've had a proliferation of these unicorns. And the reason I bring this up is because these unicorns all have one thing in common, and that's that they're trying to disrupt. And they're either trying to disrupt a staid industry or staid companies in those industries. And they're disrupting those companies through new technology or a different business model. And usually it's a combination of both. And so that's another reason why boards, I think, are concerned about culture. They want to make sure that they don't have a complacent culture inside the organization, and that they're agile enough to respond to some of these startups that can very, very quickly disrupt an industry. In fact, I've often advised companies and CEOs, I wrote an article about this, that they should consider creating a Kill Our Company committee, which is really just a small group of diverse employees from a cross section of the company that would think like unicorns. Their goal would be, if we were going to disrupt ourselves or our industry, what would we do? How would we do it? And that's just a way to stay ahead of what those unicorns are already thinking about and planning on inside the organization. Now, I mentioned right at the start, things change quickly, and I think it's always interesting to look back just a couple decades ago. The most valuable companies in the world are companies that might surprise us today. So a couple decades ago, the most valuable company in the world was GE. And I'm sure if I went back in time and predicted that GE would be kicked off the Dow Jones average in 2018 and replaced by Walgreens, most people would have laughed at me, but that's exactly what happened. And the order of market cap companies and who are the most valuable companies in the world has changed considerably and continues to change. Where today it's all technology companies. And in fact, my order is a little out of order. Apple's has the highest market cap. Microsoft is second. Amazon's third. Google is fourth. And Google goes by Alphabet, as probably many of you know. But there's one company that stayed on this list that I'm sure you've recognized as you've been looking at this chart, and that's Microsoft. And I'm a huge fan of Microsoft today, and I start out the book really talking about what that company has done from a culture renovation standpoint. And I do this because I think the lessons that we can learn from Microsoft are applicable to any industry, not just high tech, and applicable to any size of company, not just a large company like Microsoft. But I start out the book talking about and reminding people of a time period not that long ago when most were predicting that Microsoft was going to go the way of Sears. You know, it was a once great company that would just go on a slow decline into obscurity. And a lot of people had said Microsoft had lost its mojo. At the time, back in the mid 2000s, and then as we got into the early 2010s, Steve Ballmer running the company, it was a tough time for the organization. They had missed out on a number of innovations that others had done a great job bringing to the market. If we think about the mobile phone market, Microsoft was in there early, but never could get traction in the mobile market. Traction like Apple and Google did. They could also, if we just look at tablets or even MP3 players and iPods, et cetera. Microsoft had all that technology before those other organizations, but wasn't able to execute on it going forward. Even the browser was something that they got usurped by Google on. And so a lot of people pointed to a number of reasons why this was, but one of the reasons was the org structure of Microsoft and how they measured the performance of their employees. There was an artist several years ago that drew comical org structures of different technology companies, but most people thought Microsoft's was probably the funniest and most accurate. At the time, Microsoft had a performance management practice that was called stacked ranking or forced distribution, and it would force managers to rank people in their group 1 through 10 or 1 through 15 or how many people they had in their group. With the practice being that the people who were on the bottom typically were phased out of the organization, let go, et cetera. What this incented was in Microsoft Teams, and in these small groups, my incentive would be to beat my coworker and be higher on that list, rather than the two of us teaming up to figure out how do we beat the competition. And that was a very difficult thing for Microsoft in a way or a methodology that kept them from being as agile and cooperative as they could going forward. So it was probably not too shocking, although I think at the time people were surprised, as Steve Ballmer announced he was going to step down as CEO, and this set out a mad scramble to find the next CEO from Microsoft, who, lo and behold, happened to be right under their noses, and Satya Nadella. And I love this picture because these are the only 3 CEOs that Microsoft has ever had. And the only one that came up through the ranks was Satya. And that was an aspect that was not lost on the workforce. Satya had spent several years in the engineering team and moving up in that engineering team. And he had a good handle on the culture itself and knew what worked and knew what needed to be renovated going forward. And he said as much in his very first shareholder meeting. He said, our ability to change our culture is going to be the leading indicator of our future success. That was back in 2015. And he did a smart thing. He immediately partnered with his head of HR, Kathleen Hogan, and the HR team, Joe Whittinghill, a number of other very sharp people on the HR side, and said, look, we need to renovate our culture going forward. And in order to do so, he adopted a mantra around growth mindset. And many of you have probably heard this story. But Satya and his wife, who's in the lower left-hand corner, she had given him a book by Carol Dweck, who's at the bottom of the page there. She's a professor at Stanford, called Mindset. And Satya's wife had given this to him really just from a family perspective. She thought he would find it very interesting. But as he read it, he realized, this is what I want to rally my company around. And they did. They rallied the company around the concept of growth mindset, which means that skills and capabilities aren't just innate. They can be learned. And he's very famous for saying, I don't want a culture of know-it-alls. I want a culture of learn-it-alls. And I don't want to reward people for the knowledge they have. I want to reward them for sharing their knowledge. And Microsoft's culture was very much a culture of know-it-alls. Satya knew it all too well. He had witnessed it many times. And people used their knowledge for power. They used it for preservation, to get more bandwidth inside the organization, more territory, et cetera. And Satya flipped that with the concept of growth mindset. And I'm always amazed when I talk to people in Microsoft, no matter where somebody is in the hierarchy of the organization, they've got a very good handle on what growth mindset means. And they've got that good handle because Microsoft did a great job at rolling it out. This is a snapshot of a poster that has been in a lot of Microsoft conference rooms that basically just says, is this going to be a fixed mindset meeting or a growth mindset meeting, with bullet points underneath. And I love the last one under growth mindset. It's embrace challenges with agility. Microsoft has come through this pandemic pretty well. They continue to make some changes, but as the second most valuable company in the world, they've obviously demonstrated a lot of agility. And I think a big part of that agility comes from their embracing growth mindset. And I do get asked a lot, hey, does culture translate to performance? And one of the biggest reasons I like showing this case study is it's very clear from Microsoft's perspective that their ability to change their culture has had a direct impact on their performance. And there's very few people that would dispute that in Microsoft. Certainly there are other factors around their great products and some just different business dealings that they've done, some acquisitions, et cetera, during this time period. But I think if you ask Satya or any of the senior executives, what's the number one thing that has propelled the organization to have such a great financial track record since Satya became CEO, they would say it was our ability to renovate our culture. Now, I also, early in the book, show this chart on the traits of a healthy culture. And this goes back to the research study we did on culture renovation. And we asked high-performance organizations and low-performance organizations, how would you describe the culture of your company? And we had a long list of around 70 or so different attributes. Now remember, high-performance companies are those that have better revenue growth, profitability, market share, et cetera. They were much more apt to say that they had these positive attributes, except if you notice on that last one, we're a top-down command and control organization. That was something that low-performance organizations were much more apt to say about their company. And so what we're doing with other organizations on a regular basis is benchmarking their cultural traits versus what high-performing organizations are saying about their company. In fact, we even do that by going out to Glassdoor and using some AI technology to scrape some of the sentiment that's being said externally about an organization. Glassdoor being the most prominent, but there's a lot of other sites out there to showcase, how are people both internally and externally talking about the culture of the organization and benchmarking against some of these traits of a healthy culture. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so you gave us that example of Microsoft and, the high-performing organizations seem to have a good handle on what's a healthy culture. Why doesn't everybody just change their culture to be a healthy culture? And the reason they don't is because it's damn hard. And this is the reason we did this whole research study. We realized early on that a very small percentage of companies, when they set out to change organization culture, actually have success in doing so. Our research says only 15% are successful. I've seen other studies that peg it at that mark, or 20%. It's very clear that it's a low percentage of companies that succeed at actually making impact to their organizational culture. But what we wanted to explore and what the book explored is, of that 15%, is there a commonality or a blueprint from organizations that have succeeded? And that's what our original study was all about. We looked at over 7,000 organizations, a lot of large companies, almost 1,000 had 50,000 employees, but we had companies of every size as part of the study. One commonality was that 2/3 of them had experienced culture change, but again, very few told us that they had success. And you can see from the logos on the right, we dove into a number of companies that had had some success and told their story, but also gleaned from the research and from these companies, what were the steps they took to have that success? And from it, we came up with 18 action steps, a blueprint, if you will, around how to renovate your culture. Now, we divided those steps into 3 phases. And let me just tell you a little bit about why we chose the word renovation. We initially were talking about transformation when we talked about culture change, and that's the way most people talk about culture change. But it was very clear that very few of these companies actually transformed their cultures. They didn't go from what they were to something completely different. Instead, they held on to what made them unique, to what helped them be successful to begin with. And much like an old house, they were taking those hard to replace elements and renovating around them in order to increase the value. And so renovation became just a much better way to describe what these successful companies were doing. So I'm going to walk you through a few of these steps. We're not going through all 18. We don't have time for that. I'll give you some of the highlights of these steps. And as you can see, you've probably read the first 6 steps under the plan phase. Now, many times companies will skip planning altogether and they just kind of dive into building. But you wouldn't do that with an old house. You wouldn't just go in and start knocking down walls without a plan. You're inevitably probably going to knock down a load-bearing wall and ruin the whole thing. And that same analogy applies to companies. You don't want to just start going into a company with a sledgehammer, because you might take down the culture that made that company what they were to begin with. And John Ledger, who's the CEO at T-Mobile, he understood this. When he came into T-Mobile, you may recall, in the United States, T-Mobile several years ago was the absolute bottom of the barrel for wireless companies. They were losing customers hand over fist to Verizon and to AT&T and to Sprint, and it just had a horrible reputation. And John came in and said, the first thing I'm going to do is listen. And he's a very colorful character, as you can tell from this quote. But he said, I'm going to listen to my employees and listen to the customers and do what they say. But he also recognized they needed to do things pretty differently. And that's what he heard over and over again from these employees and these customers. It couldn't just be continue to do what we're doing. And they adopted the mantra of uncarrier, and it was this rebel mantra that we're going to get rid of these long contracts that wireless companies back then made you sign and commit to for several years. We're going to get rid of these very high roaming fees when you're traveling internationally to that extent. A number of other things that they did to really try to change the wireless industry. But the best thing he did was that listening aspect. Now, I always love this picture because John, when he came into the company, looked more like the guy on the left. And in order to be the rebel company, he renovated himself and always wore the logo, a lot of T-shirts, leather, sunglasses, grew his hair long. And he became, that rebel that he wanted the company to personify. And I think when you're changing your culture, it's interesting to think about, what label do we want to put on it that we can really rally around, like growth mindset at Microsoft or uncarrier at T-Mobile. But, first and foremost, listening is critical. And we've seen during the pandemic, a lot of companies are checking the sentiment of the workforce much more frequently. I love some of this natural language processing coupled with AI technology that's allowing companies to to get a handle on sentiment more easily. And a lot of companies are checking this on a weekly and daily basis. In fact, Amazon's one of those companies. Amazon asks employees to answer a question before they log on each day, and it's just one question. But they use it very strategically. And in the book, one that I highlighted that's gotten a lot of recognition is your manager a simplifier or a complexifier? And that got a lot of managers at Amazon just kind of thinking about their own style and started a conversation. And they're using that question to set a conversation inside the organization, which I think is a very smart way to do it, as well as just gathering data and feedback. Now, another very important concept in the book is recognizing that in any organization, there are go-to people that everybody seems to turn to. And these are people that are influencers, they're energizers, you're going to them for subject matter expertise, but sometimes just for a pick-me-up. And we all can think of people like that in our own organizations. Conversely, there are people that when you talk to them, you just leave with the life sucked out of you, and they're energy drainers. Those influencers and energizers are people that you want to enlist as culture ambassadors inside the organization. And I profiled a number of companies that did this very successfully, like AbbVie was one that created a culture ambassador team. Intel is doing this today as well, that is made up of these influencers, that when you're setting out your culture change, these are the people that are going to make it happen at the ground level and throughout the organization. The problem is finding these people. Now, we're all familiar with the hierarchical structure, but that's not the way work gets done. Work gets done and workflow happens through a network structure. And oftentimes the person who is at the top of the hierarchy is not in the middle of the workflow. In fact, oftentimes they're on the outside or the outskirts of that network structure. And the person who's in the middle of the beehive is somebody who's buried in the hierarchy. This is very, very common. Sometimes they're even introverts, not extroverts. And as a result, if you ask senior leaders, hey, who are these key influencers? They're going to get a few of them right, but they're going to miss well over half of the really key influencers inside the organization because they're just buried. And so we're big proponents of using organizational network analysis, which is a technique through surveys or through monitoring other communication flow to understand who are the Mitchells inside the organization. Where is all the communication and collaboration flowing? Who are the people giving others energy inside the company? O&A also helps understand, do we have entire departments that pretty much only talk to themselves and never really integrate with the rest of the organization? This is very common in acquisitions, where the acquired company really doesn't ever get assimilated into the acquiring company. O&A, and we don't have time to go into all the nuances of organizational network analysis, but if you go out to our website, you'll see a lot of info on it. This is a way to really understand who do we need to enlist as culture ambassadors inside our organization. Another aspect of the plan phase is just defining what the measures are going to be for how you're going to measure your success on culture change. 2/3 of organizations that were successful, they did this up front. They decided what measures are we going to put in place, how are we going to measure it, with qualitative, quantitative information. You can see that same NACD report. They're asking for that as well from companies. Maybe more scary is that almost all of the companies who are unsuccessful at changing their culture did this. And this was a clear indication that you really need to set these measures up front. Now, I talk about this in the book in great detail, but there's a lot of ways you can measure corporate culture. Everybody, typically does an engagement survey. I shouldn't say everybody, but most companies do an engagement survey. That's one way. That's one measure of a culture. If you're relying solely on your engagement survey, that's not going to give you what you need. It's a false proxy typically for what the culture is. You have to take it a step further and do some of those employee listening strategies, employee sentiment. I always love employee net promoter score, which is just like customer net promoter score, but instead of asking customers, would you recommend this product or this company to your friends, to your family, you're asking the same thing from employees. Would you recommend this as a great place to work for your friends and family, and measuring NPS the same way you do it for customers? There's a lot of other things that companies are doing to measure their culture, and I'm listing some of them here. It's not an exhaustive list, but certainly that's an important aspect of culture renovation. Well, let me move on from the plan phase, and there are other steps there, obviously, that I didn't go into, and we'll go into a couple steps in the build phase. And again, 6 steps here around communicating that change is coming, painting a vision for the future, collaborating, creating a co-creation mindset. First thing I'm going to talk about, though, is ferreting out the skeptics and the non-believers early. And I have told many a group this is the hardest step out of all 18, but a very important one. And we found in many of the companies that are very successful, and some of those CEOs that I interviewed, they struggled with this because there were people on the senior team or in very powerful positions that just weren't on board with whatever culture change they wanted to enact. And it's a lot like Jim Collins's book, Good to Great, and getting the right people on the bus. It's the same thing with culture change. You've got to make sure that you're either convincing those skeptics and non-believers early of why this is important, or moving them out of the way. And a number of organizations replaced senior leaders that were not able or willing to embrace and model this change. Another thing I talk about in the book is the importance of stories and the history of the organization. There are things in every company that you want to celebrate, and you also want to make sure that new employees really understand why some things are the way they are. So telling stories can be a great way to do that, and I gave some examples in the book of how companies are effectively telling those stories. But also using symbols as a shortcut to those stories is something a number of successful companies have done. Booz Allen Hamilton is one, and they have 5 values. Like a lot of companies have a small set of values in the organization. They've literally written their values in stone, and then they hand those stones out to employees who exhibit that value. And this is a very ceremonious aspect of how they're reinforcing those values, and employees proudly display these stones and collect these stones around those values. Or another company, a much smaller company called BDA that I profiled in the book, it's a sports marketing company. They've adopted Tigger as their mascot because even though Tigger's not the smartest cat in the forest, he's the pick-me-up guy. He's that energizer. And if Piglet is lost, we're going to go find him. Or if somebody needs cheering up, we're going to cheer him up. And so they teach people how to be Tiggers to other people around them and have that Tigger spirit. And they hand out stuffed Tiggers. They've probably purchased more, they think, than any company on the planet, as a symbol to people who have that Tigger spirit and that Tigger attitude. Those are just a couple examples, but I think they're good examples of how you can use those symbols as a shortcut to the story. Last thing I'll mention in the build phase that successful companies did very well is they trained their leaders, not just their senior leaders, but mid-level managers and frontline leaders on the behaviors they wanted to see to drive and embody that desired culture change. Employees are going to do what leaders do, and they're not always going to do what you wrote on a wall or put in a PowerPoint. And so these companies spent the energy, the time, the budget to train these leaders to walk the talk and to exhibit and embody the leadership aspects that drive the culture that they wanted to put in place. And you can see that the highly successful companies did this way more than the companies that weren't successful at all. So put that time and energy and budget into training. All right, the last phase is the maintain phase. Again, another phase that sometimes gets ignored. There can be a lot of hoopla around building and creating a different culture, a new culture. But unless you work at maintaining it, it's pretty easy to sort of drift back to the way things used to be. And so there's a lot of talent aspects around onboarding, around promotion and performance management, ERGs or affinity groups, talent mobility, that make up the maintain phase. And I'll give you a highlight of just a few of them. One is around onboarding, which has gotten a lot more written about it lately as we've spent the last year and a half, and it looks like it's going to go on for much longer, onboarding new employees virtually. And I've got employees in my own organization that have never met any other people inside the company other than over Zoom or Teams or some video connection. And the same is true for a lot of your companies, I'm sure. Now, onboarding has changed quite a bit, though, and I think organizations have recognized that they shouldn't treat onboarding as a one-and-done event. It definitely should not be treated as a half-day, 1 day, 1 week kind of thing. Onboarding needs to be an ongoing event, and it needs to focus on making relationships inside the company. That's the biggest predictor of whether somebody is going to flame out after the first year or whether they're going to succeed inside the organization. How connected do they become to subject matter experts, to those influencers, those energizers inside the company that can help them succeed? How much were they pulled in by others based on their own expertise that they brought to the organization, and having a feeling of worth inside the company? And we've all seen this. The people that don't make it are typically kind of lonely. They just never really assimilated. Measure the relationships and focus on making those relationships early for those new people coming in. Start onboarding even before the employee's first day on the job. That's what a number of organizations are also looking at, is how do we get people integrated into our culture, getting the info they need even before they start. Ghosting has become a big problem in a lot of organizations where you've given an offer to somebody and then they never show up. You got to make sure that you're putting that effort into the relationships. Same is true for performance management. There's been a lot written around moving away from ratings, certainly moving away from that stacked ranking or forced distribution that I mentioned earlier, but also just moving away from formal performance management to really more informal, ongoing conversations by managers with employees. We've got a lot of info out on our website around that. But the important thing to take away, I think, when it comes to culture change is realign your performance management practices to enforce that change or to support that change that you want to see. A lot of the companies that were very successful at culture change did that. They changed their performance management practices or moved what they were measuring, how they were measuring things to be more in line with that culture change they wanted to see. One of the things that they're putting more emphasis on, particularly with managers inside the organization, is around the manager's ability to move talent inside the company. I just wrote an article that was published last Friday in HBR on the importance of talent mobility. And the concept here is that if you've got really good people on your team, don't allow talent hoarding to happen. This is something that happens in a lot of low-performing organizations. Managers try to keep their top talent hidden from everybody else. They try to keep that talent in their own group, their own department, instead of the opposite, which is encouraging that top talent to move into other divisions, departments, groups, what have you, even sometimes external companies that you work with. There's a lot of wonderful things that happen when talent moves on a regular basis. Communication, collaboration improves. Really, the overall understanding of culture and the understanding of what different departments improves. And for the talent itself, they get a much better idea of the organization itself and develop their skills and capabilities as a result of moving around the organization. If you recognize managers that move talent and even reward managers to move talent, those former talent hoarders will suddenly become talent magnets when people realize, I want to go work for somebody who's going to get my career moving. It doesn't always have to be upward. It can be across, but who's going to help me develop as an individual. Go read the article if you want more info on talent mobility. but this is one of the least utilized but most successful talent techniques inside of organizations. So I'm going to stop there. I know we probably have some questions that I want to get to. I do want to point to, there's an entire website for the book itself at culturerenovation.com. You'll find a lot more info out there, tools, other stories from different companies. There's a newsletter that I write on a monthly basis around culture renovation. So check that out if you want more information. But also, here's how to find me on LinkedIn and Twitter if you want to just follow me and some of the things that we're sharing and writing about.